Hello and welcome to another episode of Ancient Agriculture. In this episode, I'll talk about the history of wine in Spain. This is a paper by Dr. Stefan K. Ehrlichinger of Texas Tech University. The earliest known wines originate in Neolithic times in regions that include northwestern Iran, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russian Georgia. The oldest known proof of archaeological winemaking dates back to the dig site Haji Frias Tepe, a Neolithic site in northwestern Iran that dates between 5000 and 5400 BC. The shape of the grape seeds harvested from that dig site proves that domesticated, not wild, grapes were utilized in the winemaking process at that time period. The oldest known winemaking facility dates back to 4100 BC in southern Armenia at a site called Arini 1. Again, the shape of the seeds indicates that domesticated grapes were utilized. Based on current evidence, wine grapes were introduced into the Iberian Peninsula about 3,000 years ago. From there, the Phoenicians brought vine cuttings and knowledge of viticulture to southern Spain. Indeed, a decorated cup of the 4th century BC can be found in a tomb in the Ribera del Duero region prior to any Roman influence. Remnants of biochemicals within the cup, such as tartaric acid and phenol compounds, showcases that this cup once did have wine in it. The Phoenicians from Tyre established Gadir, the walled city, now known as Cadaz, and Zira, now known as Jerez, and Malacca, now known as Magala, and other settlements around 800 BC. Others quote 1100 BC, but the oldest artifact of Phoenician origin is dated to 800 BC, so this is more likely. One of the oldest parts of the archaeological site in Casal di Dona Blanca dates back to 600 BC and is located between Jerez and Cadiz, and it's an ancient trough where grapes would be stomped, called a Phoenician lago, or lagar in Portuguese. The Phoenicians took advantage of the warm and dry climate to make sweet and strong white wines along the coast of southern Spain, in Magala, for much of its trade. The Phoenician presence within Spain ended with the expansion of the Carthage Empire around 500 BC. In 270 BC, Hamilcar Barca, father of Hannibal, established a capital at Carthago Nova, now known as Cartagena, and founds Barcelona. The remnants of the Phoenician Empire flee to what is now known as Tunisia. Carthage grows in power over time, but as Rome grows, the First Punic Wars happen, which grant Rome power over Sicily and much of the maritime trade in the central and western parts of the Mediterranean. The Second Punic War between 218 BC and 201 BC saw Hannibal trying to conquer Italy, but not attack Rome itself. The Romans switched to guerrilla tactics, however, and sent one of the generals known as Scipio, also known as Africanus, to Spain to cut off the supply lines of Hannibal. Scipio conquers much of Spain and the entirety of the Iberian Peninsula, ending the Phoenicians' presence there. This was followed by the Third Punic War, which resulted in the complete destruction of Carthage and the final end of the Carthaginian Empire. The Spanish colonies then became added into Rome and demanded wine wherever they settled. And wine they got. The philosopher Strabo from ancient Greece mentions Spanish wine, although they do not comment on its quality. Ovid, the Roman poet, suggests that Spanish wines are strong and expensive. Following that, various pieces of evidence suggest that wine was shipped from Spain all across the Roman Empire. Such evidence includes marked amphorae, which had the initials of Lucius Quintus Secundus the Elder, a wine dealer from southern Spain. This continues until 409 AD, with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire was knocked down by several invasions, such as the Vandals from 409 to 429, and later on the Visigoths from 429 to 711, alongside several other tribes such as the Hashkisi of what is today Galatia, the Silingini of Alandusia, and the Alans of Portugal. There's no evidence of any examples of intermixing with the locals between the invaders, and the local peoples. And indeed, Spanish architecture, language, wine, and law has been more or less unchanged since then. The Vandals ran across into Spain at 409, challenging Roman rule, and conquering parts of the Western Roman Empire. From there, the emperor, Hieronymus, encourages the Visigoths to reclaim Hispania for Rome with a land grant from Bordeaux to Telos. The Visigoths then conquered the Vandals and rule it in much the same way the Romans did. This group of people followed a sect of Christianity that was not Trinitarian. Both the Catholics, the primary Trinitarian sect of Christianity, and the Visigoths warred with each other quite extensively after the Catholics began converting Jewish people in 589. Prior to that, they disliked each other, but they weren't at each other's throats. Ultimately, the Visigoths broke away from the Roman Empire and conquered it outright. The Roman Emperor Justinian attempts to reconquer Spain and Hispania, but fails, and the Visigoths reclaim the location in 572. Little to no trade happened during this time period, but the winemaking remained unchanged. In 711, however, the Berber Islamic group Tarki ibn Ziyad crosses from North Africa into Spain, defeats the Visigoths' leader Roderick the Galet, and conquers Spain outright, with what remains of Spain being conquered by another commander, Muzzil bin Nasir, which means Moses in Berber. By 732, Portugal, South Spain, and Central Spain were all conquered. Only the land past the Douro River in Spain and the southern half of the city of Coimbra in Portugal remained unconquered. The Muslim armies even enter France to try to conquer it, but fail. In 740, an Arab army is sent from Damascus to quell the Berber rebellion, and is beaten badly on its way across North Africa, with the survivors forced to live with the Berber populations in conquered Spain, creating hostilities between both groups for centuries. All territories under Islamic rule were ruled by the Caliph, Umayyad dynasty. This dynasty was overthrown in 750 by the Abbasids, after which Baghdad became the center of Islamic power, and the influence of Islamic political power shifted from the Arabs to the Persians, with the last surviving member of the Umayyad dynasty, Abd al-Rahman, uniting the Arabs and Berbers and becoming the leader of Cordoba, becoming the new king in what he hoped to be a new Umayyad dynasty and empire. His grandson created a golden age within this kingdom, during which time he chose to erect a large library, indeed the largest library in the medieval world. And Abd al-Rahman III then declares himself the Caliph in 912. In 927, he crushes the Malwad rebellion led by a Visigoth descendant family. After he died and his son Al-Hakam II died early on, his grandson Hisham II, at the age of 10 years old, took over, becoming a figurehead controlled by the vizier Al-Mansur, during which time he grew an army and unsuccessfully attacked small Christian kingdoms in the north of Spain. This ended with a civil war, mostly Arabs versus Berbers, and in 1031 Cordoba falls and the caliphate breaks up into small kingdoms. There are 33 of these kingdoms in the 11th century, 22 in the 12th, and 10 in the 13th, competing with each other quite often, during which time temporary alliances with Christian kings were often a thing that happened. Now I'm going to have to back up a little bit and get some context. The Umayyad were far more liberal than most Islamic groups then and now. For one thing, they did some reinterpretation of different surahs that allowed for the drinking of alcoholic beverages, so long as you're either doing it during traveling time or if you're watering it down. Basically, the rules were reinterpreted so that you can drink but not get drunk. And much to the horror of the fundamentalists, he treated Jews and Christians as equals, because as the Umayyad dynasty said, they're not Muslims but they're children of the book. Now keep that in mind as you go into the story. In 1060, Pope Alexander II pushes for a reconquest of Spain and Portugal. The commander Alfonso of Leon Castile, conquers Toledo in 1085, but keeps the tolerance that its predecessors had. There's other groups of Muslims within Spain as well. The King of Tifia and the Almoravids were a Berber Muslim dynasty centered in Marrakesh, and they despised alcohol, and they did not like seeing Jews, Christians, and Muslims coexisting. They're super strict and super fundamentalist. This group was conquered and assimilated by another group called the Almohads, who are just as fanatic. And both groups began trying to halt the spread of the Reconquista initiated by the Crusades. The Alfonso lineage begins to reconquer different parts of Spain. Aragon in 1118, Portugal in 1147, Cuenca in 1177. The Almohads were conquered again in Las Novas de Tulsa in 1212. Following that, Cordoba was conquered again by the Christians in 1236, Sevilla in 1248, and Jerez in 1264, taking all the vineyards within these regions and increasing wine production. Following that, the conquest stops for 200 years, with the town of Jerez marking the frontier between Christian and Islamic rule. The only part of Spain not reclaimed was a spot called Granada, a small refuge for various Muslims and Jewish population. The combination of the geographic difficulty in conquering this region, combined with the Black Plague and the onset of the Little Ice Age, limited the conquest of this region. However, the union between Isabel of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, with the latest pope allowing them to establish a special branch of the Inquisition, placed under the control of the Crown of Spain, not of the Pope, allowed Spain to become its own kingdom, semi-independent of the Church. In 1484, the leader of Granada attempts to invade Castle Castile and failed, and was forced to become a puppet leader of Granada, effectively bringing all of Spain under Christian rule. This also led all the Jews to be expelled from Spain at that same time. In 1492, under the patronage of Isabel, Christopher Columbus finds America, bringing the Spanish Empire into being. In 1750, the Treaties of Madrid split the Portuguese and Spanish empires into two, with both gaining carte blanche to do whatever they wanted with their own territories. For wine in Spain, in the Christian era, it was known that in the 10th century the Palomino family owned a great deal of vineyards that produced wine near Jerez. Today's dominant sherry grape, the Palomino Fino, is named after them. In the early 1100s, King Henry of England traded wolves for Jerez wine, made by his family. In the Christian parts of Spain, improvements in winemaking and wine technology arrived with the Cistercians, who expanded networks of the abbeys throughout Europe, from their home bases in Burgundy. During the reconquest of Spain, the Cistercians often cultivated grain and fruits and wine plants. The innovations to winemaking were that wine should be macerated for a longer time than it was before to extract more color and tannin, and that barrels should be kept full to prevent the oxidation of wine, and that the wine barrel should be kept at a very constant temperature. Various regulations regarding the selection of soil before planting wine grapes led to the creation of the primordial form of what we now know as viticulture. In the 1340s, large quantities of wine from Jerez were exported to the court of Edward III in England. This sherry wine is likely a lot different than the sherry wine of today. It was probably sweet and powerful due to natural fermentation, but was not fortified or matured under floor. It is likely, however, that the ability to do large-scale distillation was a product of Islamic winemaking skills, as the Persian physician who lived between the late 7th century and the early 9th century AD, Ibn Zachariah al-Razi discovered that alcohol, when concentrated to a high level, is really good for dressing wounds and sterilizing wounds. He's still celebrated to this day. Indeed, in Iran, the 27th of August is Pharmacist Day, or Razi Day. This primordial technique was likely used to make fortified alcohol but I digress. In 1345, many of these rules regarding wine were imposed into actual rules by Don Juan Manuel, as well as new rules regarding theft of wine grapes, such as anybody who steals cuttings from a vineyard will be fined half a dinero per cutting. In the 1400s, new vineyards were planted farther and farther away from city walls, suggesting that safety was becoming less of an issue. Some of the best Spanish vineyards were planted at this time, as they're looking for the best land, not necessarily the safest land. In 1483, more rules were imposed by the English, French, and Flemish merchants to guarantee wines of predictable quality. In 1496, the second daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, Joanna, marries Philip the Handsome, the Duke of Burgundy, and son of Maximilian I of Habsburg. Philip I becomes the first Habsburg king of Castile. He was unfortunately succeeded by Joanna herself because he died, leaving her a widow. Catherine of Aragon, another daughter of Ferdinand Isabel, marries King Henry VIII, resulting in good relations between the Catholic Church in Spain and England. It didn't, however, when Henry divorces Catherine and in 1536 declares himself supreme head of the Church of England. And so, the relationship of England and Spain went back to business as usual. On the 26th of January 1510, King Ferdinand signs a decree that initiates large-scale slave trading across the Atlantic to work at his gold mines. In 1516, the eldest son of Philip and Joanna inherits Spain as Charles I, as well as parts of Italy and the Netherlands. In 1519, he also becomes a Holy Roman Emperor as Charles V. But due to the fact that he really hates King Francis I of France, and vice versa, various wars happen. This is compounded by the Protestant Reformation. These two factors weaken the Spanish economy, and the country increasingly depends on silver and gold from the Americas. Charles abdicates the throne in 1556, and his brother Ferdinand succeeds him, while his son, Philip II, gets the Spanish Empire, as well as the troubled Netherlands. You see, 10 of the Dutch provinces are Catholic, but 7 northern ones became Calvinist in 1567, and really do not like being ruled by a Catholic monarch, and despise the Inquisition. In 1579, they band together and formed the Union of Utrecht, and turn against Spain, declaring themselves independent. The Dutch turn to trade due to the lack of natural resources and become very good at it, becoming close competitors with England. In the process, they dominate the wine trade. In 1587, Martin Frobisher of Francis Drake's fleet burns a portion of the Spanish fleet in the Bay of Cadiz and sacks the region for 3 days. This made the battle with England in 1588 worse, since that used new barrels that were prone to leaking, and most of their weaponry got wet and unusable, specifically the gunpowder. Then a massive plague hit in 1596 to 1602, which results in over 1 million deaths. Indeed, Philip II dies from this plague as well, leaving his son Philip III to inherit the throne and a declining country, during which time Philip III expels the Moors to North Africa, losing 4 to 5% of its remaining active population, and the problematic economics that this causes as well. The Spanish Empire expands again under King Philip IV, but due to poor economics and increased reliance on gold and silver from mines in Central and South America, the economics are bleak. The remaining kings played little role in the winemaking industry, however. But during this time, a great many different varieties of wine grapes were imported to Spain, such as the American species Labrusca, Rupestris, and Riparia. A great many vinifera cultivars were introduced from Europe to Central and South America, starting in Mexico and going into Peru, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, and other countries in the like. And it became an important source of wine for Spain, as well as an important source of income for Spain, as early as the early 1500s. By 1510, wine makes up 1/3 of a cargo within Spanish ships for trade purposes. Spain became the wine capital of the world for quite some time until the Armada debacle due to shortages of sherry. James IV had to limit the consumption of wine to a meager 12 gallons per day. At that time, most wines were light, have low alcohol and low tannin, and are prone to oxidizing, so they don't survive longer than 1 year. The fortified forms are more resilient and fetch higher prices. In time, the Dutch took over the largest wine dealer in the world title and further developed fortification. Due to heavy competition from the Dutch, the Spanish grape farmers had to cut back on production through prohibition of exporting wine, unless for church use. This continued until 1821. After the War of Spanish Succession begins in 1701, it partly ends with the Treaty of Urich in 1713, although many disputes still linger. And Spain and Portugal remained formally at war until the Treaty of Madrid in 1750. Philip, Duke of Anjou, is recognized as King Philip V in Spain, but a stipulation was created that he must renounce any right to the French throne, and the other descendants of King Louis XIV must renounce any claim to the Spanish throne. This was agreed to. The Netherlands and Spanish and the Italians become part of King Charles VI's Holy Roman Empire. Portugal increases its territories in Brazil and Great Britain with the capture of Gibraltar in 1704. Philip V begins the unification of Spain by placing the country under laws of Castile, as well as creating a centralized administration in Madrid. He abdicates in 1724 in favor of his son, Louis I, who unfortunately died 7 months later. He returns to power as his second son, Ferdinand, is only 11 years old. He later dies in 1748. King Ferdinand VI modernized the navy and took measures to stimulate trade with the Americas. He died in 1759 and was succeeded by another one of his brothers, Charles III, who gives up the kingdom of Naples to become the King of Spain. In the interim, the Lisbon earthquake of 1755 destroys most of Lisbon, and the future Marquis de Pombal takes charge, transforming Portugal from a medieval theocracy to a modern state. Unfortunately, this results in him destroying much of the Catholic Church and expelling the Jesuits. This creates a domino effect. The Jesuits are expelled from Portugal in 1759, then they're expelled from France in 1762 following a financial scandal, and then they're expelled from Spain in 1767. Indeed, the Jesuits were expelled from all Spanish territories. This created a power vacuum that was filled by the Franciscans, which changed the way wine was grown, using their methods, not the Jesuit methods of old. And much of what is used in California today was passed down from that group. Unfortunately, they were not as economically viable as the Jesuits were, and relied entirely on financial and material support of the Spanish government. This unfortunately goes bye-bye when Napoleon invades the peninsula in 1808. During the interim, King Charles III dies in 1788, and his son Charles IV becomes king. He is physically strong, but is more interested in wrestling and hunting than in governing. Following the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon, the power of Spain now rests in the hands of Charles' wife, Maria Luisa, and their very close friend, Manuel de Godoy. In the interim, in Portugal, in Britain, the slave trade is abolished, and Britain eventually forced Portugal to do the same thing. At the same time, the Spanish fleet at Trafalgar. In 1805, the Franco-Spanish fleet at Trafalgar is destroyed, breaking the alliance of France and Spain, rendering in 1808 Charles IV abdicates in favor of his son Ferdinand VII, who seeks an alliance with Napoleon, which bites him on the butt because Ferdinand gets deposed, and Napoleon's brother Joseph becomes the new king of Spain. Effectively, Napoleon had conquered Spain. Joseph's reign ended with the Spanish revolt against Napoleon, creating a new series of rules and laws and a constitution. It never gets established, but becomes a source of political and social unrest. Following the United States War of Independence against England, several other countries under Spanish rule undergo revolutions of their own and kick the Spanish out. In 1814, Joseph leaves Spain for the Americas, while pinching some of Spain's crown jewels. Ferdinand VII reclaims his throne until 1833, while repudiating the Constitution. Several decades of political and civil unrest follow. As you may have guessed, these types of wars did not do well for anybody in terms of wine grape producers, and there are only 9 sherry shippers left in business in Jerez. However, due to the old rules of guild and raising grape harvesters of Jerez being repealed, sherry wines can now be aged. Something called flor is a type of yeast that floats to the top of the surface of wine. Allowing it to continue to ferment under these conditions allows for an increase in the alcohol content. Keeping the alcohol content around 70-18% prevents its development, however. The common wine yeast develops this type of flor on finished dry wine and feeds on glycerol and trace amounts of sugar, which increases the alcohol content while preventing vinegar bacteria from turning into vinegar. After Ferdinand VII returns to power, an army rebellion forces him to accept the constitution, and Spain became liberal for about 3 years. Then the French intervene again, and Ferdinand gains full authority. Spain is also broke at this point and is forced to sell Florida for $5 million. Indeed, by the time Ferdinand died in 1833, Spain has lost most of its colonies in the Americas. His firstborn son was Ferdinand's very conservative brother Carlos, who expects the crown, but instead goes to Ferdinand's 3-year-old daughter, Isabel II, leaving the regent, her mother Maria Cristina, as the de facto leader. Carlos flees to Portugal, builds military support in the north of Spain, and invades his home country. This became the first of 3 Carlist Wars, creating even more economic and social problems. Isabel II, being 3 years old, is incompetent and highly unpopular as a ruler. This child then goes into exile in Paris in 1866, leaving anarchy in charge of the country. In 1866, leaving the anarchy in charge of the country, the courts pick a new king for Spain, the liberal Amadeus Savoy, son of Victor Emmanuel of Italy. But he realizes that Spain is ungovernable, and goes, "Fuck this shit, I'm out." In 1874, the army pledges allegiance to Isabel II's son, Alfonso, which restores some stability to the country, but he dies prematurely in 1885 and is succeeded by his posthumous son, also named Alfonso. But by this point, the king has become irrelevant. Spain then loses the Spanish-American War of 1898 and gives up Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Philippines, bringing some economic investment from foreign groups, which provides a temporary boost to the economy. Spain remains neutral during the First World War, as the left favors the Allies while the right favors Germany. Spain finds its own way by supplying both sides of weapons. The next Alfonso king, during the Great Depression, delegates all his power to his minister Miguel Primo de Vera, who becomes the first military dictator of Spain. The Second Spanish Republic is unable to unify the country, which is divided by 2 groups: the Carlist fascist group, dominated by Falange, and anarchist socialists. This culminates in the Spanish Civil War. As a result, Francisco Franco emerges as the unchallenged leader of Spain, reigning over the country during World War II for 36 years. Economic recovery starts with the 1953 treaty with the United States as a result of tourism. Mr. Franco died in 1975, and a new constitution was formed. In much the same way political shaking was happening during the First and Second World Wars, several natural disasters and wars also caused great deals of strife. World War I, World War II, the Russian Revolution, Prohibition, and the Great Depression all caused varying degrees of harm during the era of 1814 towards the end of the Franco regime. It is very difficult to, after all, produce wine when there's always fighting going on. To aid with the more difficult methods of making wine, a Spanish business person, Mr. Murata, obtains iron vats from Bordeaux and learns how to use vats to make wine rather than using the traditional crushing method, making it easier to produce indoors and reducing the amount of heat, increasing the quality of wine. He also utilized oak barrels instead of the preceding regular barrels. It's at this point that modern winemaking was also introduced as well. But several natural disasters came in. The constant trade between the Americas and the Old World led to the introduction of new diseases that were not native to Europe but wound up in Europe anyways. the fungal species powdery mildew, the root-chewing aphid Phylloxera, and another fungus called downy mildew. Powdery mildew first arrived in England in 1845, and from there it spread to France and from there into the rest of Europe. Then there's Phylloxera, which was introduced to France in 1863, and from there it spread across all of Europe. A solution was reached, grafting the common wine grape onto wild stock of different American species to improve resistance to Phylloxera. The combination of prohibition and war, however, also reduced the price of wine, forcing them to dilute good wine with bulk wine of unknown origin. This resulted in new regulations. Unions between winemakers formed, and royal decrees involving who can and cannot produce wine and what wines are allowed to bear the title of Rioja wine. A new permanent patent was created to define Rioja, and only specific winemakers are allowed to use the name, title, and produce wine within that region. The legalese was structured in 1945 and became active in 1953. The Spanish Civil War was a disaster for the wine country, and the dictatorship reduced even further, thanks to a lack of access to global markets. As of right now, Spain is now a multi-party constitutional monarchy. In 1986, Spain joins the European Economic Community, which becomes the EU, and new regulations are removed on winemaking, specifically laws regulating irrigation. New modern strains were also developed as well of different wine grapes, although most of the traditional ones are still intact. And that about covers everything. Thank you for watching. Thank you for watching this video. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to me on BitChute for a greater variety of content, 4 videos a week. And thank you to all my subscribers on both platforms. I appreciate it.